October 12, 1945. Sugamo Prison Compound, Tokyo. The autumn rain falls in cold sheets across the concrete courtyard, turning the ground to a slick mirror that reflects the gray sky and the austere walls of what was, until 3 months ago, one of Japan's most notorious military prisons. Lieutenant Commander Elizabeth Hartley stands beneath the eaves of the administrative building, watching a column of women march across the yard in formation. Not prisoners, though they were until recently classified as such, but something else entirely. Japanese female officers, members of the Imperial Army and Navy's auxiliary services, moving with military precision despite the rain, despite the surrender, despite the complete inversion of everything they were trained to believe about hierarchy and duty. Elizabeth has been in occupied Japan for 6 weeks, assigned to the Women's Affairs section of the Supreme Commander Allied Powers, tasked with the impossible job of managing thousands of former Japanese military women who exist in a legal and social limbo. They are not quite prisoners of war. Most were in non-combat roles, and the legal framework for their detention is ambiguous at best. They are not quite free civilians. They remain subject to military authority, confined to designated compounds, their movements restricted and monitored. They are something unprecedented in modern military occupation, educated, trained, ideologically committed women who have lost not just a war, but the entire social structure that gave their lives meaning. Elizabeth has read the intelligence reports, has been briefed on the suicide rates among female military personnel in the immediate post-surrender period, has been warned that these women may be dangerous, unpredictable, fanatical. What she has not been prepared for is the idea that will come to her this morning. Watching them march in formation through the rain with a discipline that shame and defeat have not eroded. That perhaps the solution to managing these women is not to manage them at all, but to ask them to manage themselves. The concept of female military service in Imperial Japan emerged from necessity rather than ideological commitment to gender equality. As the war expanded and male casualties mounted, the Japanese military establishment faced a critical manpower shortage. The solution, implemented reluctantly and with considerable cultural resistance, was to recruit women for non-combat support roles. Communications, logistics, administration, nursing, factory supervision, even technical positions in code breaking and intelligence analysis. These women were not given combat training. Japanese military culture remained deeply patriarchal, viewing female participation in actual warfare as both unnecessary and culturally inappropriate. But they were given uniforms, ranks, military discipline, and most significantly, ideological indoctrination in the same nationalist mythology that motivated male soldiers. They were taught that service to the emperor was the highest calling, that Japan's destiny was to lead Asia to liberation from Western imperialism, that individual sacrifice for the collective good was not merely duty, but spiritual fulfillment. By 1945, approximately 200,000 women had served in various capacities within the Japanese military and affiliated organizations. They were clerks in headquarters, radio operators in communication centers, nurses in field hospitals, supervisors in munitions factories. They were educated, many had secondary school or even university training, at a time when female education in Japan was uncommon. They were disciplined, subjected to military training regimens that emphasized obedience, endurance, and collective responsibility. And they were committed. The ideology of service to emperor and nation was not merely imposed from above, but internalized, woven into their understanding of identity and purpose. These are not conscripts pressed into service against their will. These were volunteers who had chosen military service as a path to meaning and contribution in a society that offered women few such opportunities. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, these women faced a crisis more profound than defeat. Male soldiers could return to civilian occupations, could reintegrate into family structures that, while damaged by war, remained recognizable. But female military personnel faced the complete destruction of the framework that had legitimized their service. The military that gave them purpose was dissolved. The emperor whose divinity justified their sacrifice had announced in his surrender broadcast that he was, after all, merely human. The ideology that promised Japan would lead Asia to a new order had been exposed as catastrophic delusion. And the society they returned to had no place for women who had stepped outside traditional roles, who had worn uniforms and given orders, who had tasted a form of autonomy and responsibility that peacetime Japanese culture did not accommodate. The suicide rate among female military personnel in the weeks following surrender was, according to fragmentary Allied intelligence reports, substantially higher than among male personnel. Some women chose death over the shame of surrender and reintegration into a society that would view their military service with suspicion or contempt. Others faced the practical reality that families, devastated by war losses and economic collapse, could not support additional members, particularly women whose military service had made them less marriageable in a culture that valued traditional femininity. The Allied occupation authorities, focused primarily on demobilizing the male military and establishing control over a potentially hostile population, initially paid little attention to the specific problem of female military personnel. They were rounded up, confined to designated compounds, and essentially warehoused while Allied planners determined what to do with them. Sugamo Prison, before the war, had been a civilian facility. During the war, it had housed political prisoners, POWs, and Japanese military personnel accused of crimes. After the surrender, it became a massive detention and processing center for various categories of former military personnel awaiting determination of their status. One section, improvised from converted barracks and surrounded by newly erected fencing, held approximately 3,000 female former military personnel. The conditions were not deliberately harsh. Allied policy required adequate food, shelter, and medical care, but they were institutional, regimented, stripped of dignity. The women slept in crowded dormitories, ate in mess halls under guard, spent their days in enforced idleness punctuated by roll calls and inspections. They were not mistreated in the sense of physical abuse, but they were treated as problems to be contained, as potential security risks requiring surveillance, as defeated enemies waiting for judgment. Lieutenant Commander Elizabeth Hartley, arriving at Sugamo in early September 1945, found a situation that troubled her both professionally and morally. The women were compliant. Japanese cultural conditioning toward authority ensured they followed orders without resistance. But they were also listless, disconnected, going through the motions of daily routine without purpose or engagement. Hartley had served as a Navy nurse during the war, had treated wounded men on hospital ships, had developed a pragmatic understanding of trauma and recovery. What she observed at Sugamo reminded her of the 1,000-yard stare she had seen in combat veterans. Not the acute stress of recent trauma, but the deeper emptiness of meaning loss, the psychological state of people who have survived but have no framework for understanding what they are surviving for. The administrative challenge was considerable. 3,000 women needed to be fed, housed, kept healthy, and eventually processed for return to civilian life. The Allied staff assigned to manage the compound consisted of approximately 40 personnel, mostly American and Australian military police and administrative clerks, with a handful of translators who were overworked and overwhelmed. The ratio of guards to internees made actual surveillance impossible. The operation depended entirely on the internees' compliance, and while that compliance was currently maintained by cultural conditioning and shock, Hartley recognized it as fragile. These were women who had been trained in military discipline, who understood hierarchy and organization, who were capable of collective action. If they decided to resist, to refuse cooperation, to simply stop following orders, the Allied staff would have no effective response short of violence, which occupation policy and basic humanity made unthinkable. But Hartley also recognized something else, that the internees possessed exactly the skills needed to manage the compound effectively. They had officers who understood logistics, personnel management, and administration. They had clerks who could maintain records and track supplies. They had nurses who could run medical facilities. They had, in essence, a complete administrative apparatus that was currently sitting idle, being managed inefficiently by an overworked Allied staff who lacked language skills and cultural knowledge. The solution was obvious, almost absurdly so. Let them run their own compound. Let the Japanese female officers organize their own people, manage their own affairs, maintain their own discipline. The Allied staff would provide oversight, resources, and ultimate authority, but the day-to-day operations would be performed by the internees themselves. The proposal, when Hartley submitted it up the chain of command, met with skepticism bordering on disbelief. Allow enemy military personnel, however non-combatant, to self-administer their own detention. Provide them with authority structures that replicated their wartime organization. Trust them to maintain order, manage supplies, enforce discipline among their own ranks. The objections were numerous and substantive. Security risks, potential for resistance organization, the possibility that weapons or contraband could be concealed, the general principle that defeated enemies should not be granted autonomy, even in limited contexts. Several senior officers flatly refused to approve the plan, considering it naive at best and potentially dangerous at worst. But Hartley had an advantage: the practical reality that the current system was unsustainable. The compound was overcrowded, the Allied staff was exhausted, and the bureaucratic machinery for processing female military personnel back into civilian life was months behind schedule. Something had to change, and Hartley's proposal, however unconventional, offered a solution that required no additional resources and might actually improve conditions. After 3 weeks of bureaucratic maneuvering, conditional approval was granted. The internees could form internal administrative structures and take on management roles, but under strict supervision, with frequent inspections and subject to immediate revocation if problems emerged. The symbolic object that would come to represent this transformation is not military in nature. It is a clipboard, a simple wooden board with a metal clip holding sheets of paper. In every well-run organization, clipboards represent authority and responsibility. The person carrying the clipboard is the person who knows what needs to happen, who tracks progress, who ensures completion. When Hartley begins implementing the new administrative structure, she does so by distributing clipboards to selected Japanese officers, along with forms, schedules, and inventories. These are the tools of management, the physical embodiments of authority granted and responsibility accepted. The clipboards become visible symbols throughout the compound of the shift from passive detention to active self-administration. The first woman Hartley approaches with the proposal is Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka, age 31, former administrative officer with the Imperial Navy's Personnel Bureau in Tokyo. Tanaka's file indicates she has a university degree in economics, speaks functional English, and served in her position for 4 years with exemplary efficiency ratings. She has been at Sugamo for 6 weeks, has caused no disciplinary problems, and has been observed informally organizing her dormitory, ensuring equitable distribution of blankets, mediating disputes, maintaining cleanliness standards. She is, in other words, a natural leader continuing to lead, even without official authority. Hartley summons Tanaka to the administrative office, a small room furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet. Spare but functional. Tanaka enters with the rigid posture of a subordinate reporting to superior authority, eyes fixed on a point above Hartley's head, awaiting orders. Hartley, who has thought carefully about how to present this proposal, does not sit behind the desk that would reinforce the interrogator-prisoner dynamic. Instead, she gestures to the chairs facing each other and sits, inviting Tanaka to do the same. The gesture is small but significant, suggesting conversation between professionals rather than orders from captor to captive. What follows is not a command, but a request. Hartley explains, through a translator, that the compound requires better organization, that the current system is inefficient and unsustainable, that the Allied staff lacks the resources and cultural knowledge to manage 3,000 women effectively. She explains that she needs help, not forced labor, not coerced cooperation, but genuine assistance from someone who understands organization and leadership. She explains that she is proposing to appoint Japanese officers to administrative positions within the compound, with real authority and real responsibility. And she asks Tanaka if she would be willing to serve as chief administrative officer for the internees, organizing her fellow former military women, establishing work schedules, managing internal affairs. The symbolic object that would come to represent this transformation is not military in nature. It is a clipboard, a simple wooden board with a metal clip, holding sheets of paper. In every well-run organization, clipboards represent authority and responsibility. The person carrying the clipboard is the person who knows what needs to happen, who tracks progress, who ensures completion. When Hartley begins implementing the new administrative structure, she does so by distributing clipboards to selected Japanese officers, along with forms, schedules, and inventories. These are the tools of management, the physical embodiments of authority granted and responsibility accepted. The clipboards become visible symbols throughout the compound of the shift from passive detention to active self-administration. The first woman Hartley approaches with the proposal is Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka, age 31, former administrative officer with the Imperial Navy's Personnel Bureau in Tokyo. Tanaka's file indicates she has a university degree in economics, speaks functional English, and served in her position for 4 years with exemplary efficiency ratings. She has been at Sugamo for 6 weeks, has caused no disciplinary problems, and has been observed informally organizing her dormitory, ensuring equitable distribution of blankets, mediating disputes, maintaining cleanliness standards. She is, in other words, a natural leader continuing to lead even without official authority. Hartley summons Tanaka to the administrative office, a small room furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet, spare but functional. Tanaka enters with the rigid posture of a subordinate reporting to superior authority, eyes fixed on a point above Hartley's head, awaiting orders. Hartley, who has thought carefully about how to present this proposal, does not sit behind the desk. That would reinforce the interrogator-prisoner dynamic. Instead, she gestures to the chairs facing each other and sits, inviting Tanaka to do the same. The gesture is small but significant, suggesting conversation between professionals rather than orders from captor to captive. What follows is not a command, but a request. Hartley explains, through a translator, that the compound requires better organization, that the current system is inefficient and unsustainable, that the Allied staff lacks the resources and cultural knowledge to manage 3,000 women effectively. She explains that she needs help. Not forced labor, not coerced cooperation, but genuine assistance from someone who understands organization and leadership. She explains that she is proposing to appoint Japanese officers to administrative positions within the compound, with real authority and real responsibility. And she asks Tanaka if she would be willing to serve as chief administrative officer for the internees, organizing her fellow former military women, establishing work schedules, managing internal affairs. Tanaka's reaction is not immediate acceptance, but profound confusion. The cognitive dissonance is visible in her face. This is an American officer, representative of the conquering power, asking for help rather than demanding obedience. This is an offer of authority rather than an exercise of authority over her. The framework through which Tanaka understands military hierarchy, orders flow downward, obedience flows upward, does not accommodate this interaction. She asks, through the translator, whether this is an order disguised as a request, whether refusal is actually an option. Hartley, recognizing the deeper question, responds clearly, this is a genuine request, and refusal is genuinely possible. Hartley needs Tanaka's skills and leadership, but those things are only valuable if offered voluntarily. Coerced cooperation would undermine the entire purpose. The conversation continues for nearly an hour, moving beyond the specific proposal to deeper questions. Tanaka asks what authority she would actually have. Would she be a figurehead, or could she make real decisions? Hartley explains the boundaries. Decisions about internal organization, work assignments, dispute resolution, and resource allocation within established parameters would be Tanaka's. Decisions about security, compound policies, and relations with Allied authorities would remain with Hartley. Tanaka would have real power but not unlimited power, real responsibility but not total responsibility. It is a partnership, constrained and asymmetric, but a partnership nonetheless. Tanaka asks why Hartley is making this offer. What advantage America gains from granting Japanese officers authority over their own people? It is a shrewd question, recognizing that no occupying power acts from pure altruism. Hartley's answer is pragmatic. Because it will work better, because it will reduce friction and improve efficiency, because management by people who understand the culture and language is more effective than management by outsiders. But she adds something else, something that is not pure pragmatism. Because treating people as capable of responsibility rather than as problems to be controlled is the right thing to do. And because America claims to believe in self-governance and individual dignity. And those principles should apply even to defeated enemies. Tanaka sits in silence for a long moment, processing. Then she asks the question that will determine everything. If I accept, will the others follow? Will my authority be recognized by women who were my peers, who served in the same ranks, who may resent taking orders in this new context? Hartley acknowledges this is a real concern, but suggests that Tanaka's informal leadership over the past week suggests she already has credibility. And more importantly, the alternative, continued passive detention under Allied management, is not something most internees prefer. Tanaka accepts, not with enthusiasm or visible emotion, but with the professional acknowledgement of a difficult job that needs doing. She will organize the administrative structure, will recruit officers for key positions, will present the proposal to the broader internee population. In return, Hartley provides her with the first clipboard, with blank forms and a fountain pen, with the physical tools of administrative authority. The symbolism is not lost on either woman. This simple object represents trust, represents responsibility granted rather than power imposed. Over the following 2 weeks, Tanaka and a core group of selected officers, former logistics specialists, personnel administrators, medical supervisors, establish what becomes known informally as the Internee Administrative Committee. The structure replicates military organization, sections for food service, medical care, housing, education, recreation, and discipline. Officers are assigned to each section, not by Allied appointment, but by Tanaka's selection based on skills and experience. The organization is announced at a compound-wide assembly, where Tanaka, standing before 3,000 women with a clipboard in hand, explains the new system. The explanation is direct. The Allies have offered them the opportunity to manage their own affairs within established boundaries. This is not freedom. They remain detained, subject to Allied authority, confined to the compound. But it is autonomy, a form of self-governance that restores purpose and dignity. Cooperation will determine whether the system continues or reverts to direct Allied management. The response is not uniformly positive. Some women, particularly those from more traditional backgrounds, view the offer with suspicion, seeing it as a trap or a form of psychological manipulation. Others, exhausted and traumatized, simply do not care, wanting only to endure until they can return to whatever remains of their families. But many, particularly those who held positions of responsibility during the war, respond with visible relief. They have been living in enforced idleness, their skills and training unused, their sense of purpose evaporated. The offer to contribute, to organize, to take responsibility rekindles something that had been dormant. The transformation of the compound is rapid and remarkable. Within a week, the food service operation, previously chaotic with long lines and frequent complaints about portions, is reorganized by a former Navy supply officer who establishes efficient serving procedures, ensures equitable distribution, and reduces waste. The medical clinic, previously understaffed and overwhelmed, is expanded by recruiting nurses from among the internees, establishing regular sick call hours, and implementing preventive health measures. The dormitories, previously crowded and tense, are reorganized with clear rules for space allocation, quiet hours, and conflict resolution, enforced not by Allied guards but by internee monitors. The clipboard becomes ubiquitous throughout the compound. Women carrying clipboards move purposefully, tracking food inventory, scheduling work details, recording sick call visits, monitoring facility conditions. The clipboard signifies that the bearer has authority and responsibility, that she is not merely a detainee waiting passively, but an administrator actively managing affairs. The psychological impact is profound. The women are no longer objects of management, but agents of management, no longer passive victims of defeat, but active participants in their own governance. But the transformation is not merely administrative. It is ideological. The women who accept positions in the new system are implicitly accepting something that contradicts everything they were taught about American occupation. That the enemy can be reasonable, can be trusted to honor agreements, can offer partnership rather than domination. This acceptance does not come easily or completely. Many participants in the system maintain private reservations, view cooperation as pragmatic surrender rather than genuine reconciliation. But the daily experience of being treated as capable professionals, of having their expertise respected and utilized, gradually erodes the propaganda certainty that Americans are barbaric occupiers interested only in subjugation. The clearest evidence of this transformation emerges 3 months into the new system, when a crisis tests its resilience. A section of the compound's water supply system fails, creating unsanitary conditions and threatening disease outbreak. The Allied engineering staff, already overwhelmed with infrastructure repairs across Tokyo, estimates it will be 2 weeks before they can address the problem. Tanaka, now confident in her authority, proposes an alternative. Several internees have engineering backgrounds and, given proper tools and materials, could repair the system themselves. The proposal is approved, materials are provided, and a team of former technical officers completes the repairs in 4 days. The success is significant not for the practical accomplishment. The repair itself is not particularly complex, but for what it represents. Japanese women, detained by the occupying power, are trusted with tools and unsupervised access to critical infrastructure. They complete the work efficiently and honestly, without sabotage or resistance, because they have accepted that cooperation serves their own interests. The system works not because it is imposed, but because it is mutually beneficial. The Allies gain effective compound management without deploying scarce resources. The internees gain autonomy, purpose, and preparation for eventual reintegration into civilian life. Elizabeth Hartley, observing this evolution, recognizes that what has occurred at Sugamo is a microcosm of what occupation policy should be, but often is not. The standard approach to defeated enemies is punishment and control. Strip them of power, impose alien systems, demand compliance without offering participation. The Sugamo experiment suggests an alternative. Recognize that defeated enemies remain human beings with skills and dignity, that self-governance is more stable than imposed governance, that partnership produces better outcomes than domination. These are, in theory, core American principles: democracy, individual liberty, self-determination. The surprise is not that they work when applied to former enemies, but that applying them to former enemies is considered surprising. The symbolic moment that crystallizes this transformation occurs in February 1946, when the first group of internees is processed for return to civilian life. The women being released have spent 5 months under the new administrative system, have held positions of responsibility, have experienced a form of self-governance that Japanese society did not offer them before the war and may not offer them after. At the final processing, each woman meets with Hartley for a brief exit interview, an administrative formality to ensure they understand reintegration procedures and support services. One woman, a former communications officer named Keiko Sato, asks Hartley a question that no one has asked before. May she keep her clipboard? It is a strange request. The clipboard is military property, a simple utilitarian object with no monetary value. But Sato explains, through the translator, that she wants it as a reminder that she was trusted with responsibility, that even in defeat and detention, she was recognized as capable of leadership, that someone believed she could manage rather than merely be managed. The clipboard represents the one period in her life when she held real authority granted by choice rather than imposed by hierarchy. Hartley, moved by the request in ways she cannot quite articulate, approves it. She signs the clipboard over to Sato as personal property, writes a brief note explaining that the bearer served with distinction in an administrative capacity during detention, and suggests it might serve as a reference for future employment. The gesture is small, bureaucratically insignificant, but Sato bows deeply, clutching the clipboard as if it were precious, and for that moment, the distance between victor and vanquished, between captor and captive, between American and Japanese, narrows to something almost invisible. Word of the clipboard gift spreads through the remaining internee population. It becomes a symbol more powerful than Hartley intended. Proof that service under the new system was recognized as genuine service, that cooperation was appreciated rather than simply exploited, that the allies, or at least this one allied officer, valued their contribution. When subsequent releases occur, many women ask for similar tokens. A copy of their work assignment, a note documenting their position, some small acknowledgement that their months at Sugamo involved more than detention. Hartley, understanding the deeper need, makes such acknowledgments standard practice, creating simple certificates that document each woman's role in the administrative system. The Sugamo experiment, as it becomes known in occupation headquarters, attracts attention from other facilities facing similar challenges with female detainee populations. Several compound commanders visit to observe the system, interview participants, assess whether the model can be replicated. The response is mixed. Some commanders, recognizing the practical advantages, implement similar structures in their facilities. Others, more conservative in their approach to occupation policy, reject the model as too risky, too trusting, too inconsistent with the proper relationship between conqueror and conquered. The debate reveals deeper divisions within Allied occupation philosophy. Whether the goal is punishment or rehabilitation, control or partnership, the imposition of American values, or the cultivation of conditions where such values might emerge organically. The women who pass through the Sugamo system carry its lessons into post-war Japan. Many return to traditional roles, marriage, motherhood, domesticity, because Japanese society offers limited alternatives. But some, particularly those with higher education and urban backgrounds, pursue careers in the rebuilding economy. They work as administrators, teachers, nurses, civil servants, bringing to those roles the experience of having been trusted with responsibility, of having managed complex operations, of having participated in self-governance. They become, in small but significant ways, advocates for women's participation in public life, challenging the traditional gender hierarchies that the war disrupted but did not destroy. Yuki Tanaka, the first chief administrative officer, maintains correspondence with Elizabeth Hartley for nearly 2 decades. The letters, written in increasingly confident English, document Tanaka's post-war life. Work in local government administration, marriage to a fellow former military officer, gradual reintegration into a society that never quite knows what to make of women who wore uniforms. In a letter written in 1958, Tanaka reflects on the Sugamo experience. You asked us to help run the camp, and in doing so, you gave us more than authority. You gave us proof that we were still capable, still valuable, still worthy of trust. Everything we believed about American occupation was wrong. You did not crush us. You did not humiliate us. You treated us as professionals, as colleagues, as human beings who happened to be on the losing side. This was more disorienting than any propaganda could have predicted. It forced us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about victors and vanquished, about strength and mercy, about what it means to win with honor. The legacy of the Sugamo experiment extends beyond individual lives. It becomes a case study in occupation policy, cited in military colleges and diplomatic training programs as an example of how treating former enemies with dignity and offering genuine partnership can produce better outcomes than coercion. The lessons are not universally learned. Subsequent conflicts will see occupation authorities repeating the same mistakes of control and domination. But the example remains, a proof that alternatives exist, that the relationship between victor and vanquished need not be purely hierarchical, that even in the aftermath of brutal war, it is possible to recognize shared humanity and build cooperation from the ruins of enmity. The clipboard, preserved in Keiko Sato's family and eventually donated to a museum of women's history in Tokyo, becomes an artifact of unexpected power. It is displayed with a placard explaining its history, a simple administrative tool that represented, for a brief period in the chaos following Japan's surrender, the possibility that defeated enemies could be trusted, that authority could be granted rather than imposed, that cooperation could be genuine rather than coerced. Visitors to the museum, reading the story, confront an uncomfortable truth, that the stereotypes of victor and vanquished, of occupier and occupied, of American and Japanese, are more malleable than propaganda suggests. That in the specific circumstances of Sugamo prison in the autumn and winter of 1945-46, a small group of women on both sides of the divide chose partnership over domination, trust over control, and in doing so demonstrated that even the deepest enmities can be transcended when individuals are treated with dignity and offered genuine responsibility. The transformation Elizabeth Hartley initiated that rainy October morning, watching Japanese officers march in formation and recognizing their continued discipline as an asset rather than a threat, was not an act of naive idealism. It was a pragmatic recognition that people respond to how they are treated, that trust offered is often trust returned, that the best way to govern is to allow people to govern themselves within reasonable boundaries. These principles are foundational to democratic theory, but applying them to recently defeated enemies required a leap of faith that many in the occupation authority considered reckless. That the leap succeeded, that the partnership worked, that the women of Sugamo managed their own compound with efficiency and integrity, proved something important. That American democratic principles are not merely propaganda, not merely self-serving mythology, but functional approaches to human organization that work even in the most unlikely circumstances. The Japanese women officers who were stunned when America asked them to help run the camp were experiencing a collision between ideology and reality. They had been taught that American occupation would mean subjugation, that defeat would bring humiliation, that the victors would impose their will through force. Instead, they encountered an offer of partnership, a grant of authority, a recognition of their capabilities. The stunning was not merely surprise, but a fundamental challenge to their understanding of power and governance. In the militaristic, hierarchical society they came from, authority flowed from position and was maintained through force. In the American system they encountered, authority could be granted, could be earned, could be exercised through cooperation rather than coercion. This was, in its way, as effective a demonstration of democratic principles as any political speech or propaganda campaign. It proved through action rather than rhetoric that self-governance works, that people trusted with responsibility generally rise to meet it, that partnership produces better outcomes than domination. The women who accepted clipboards and administrative positions at Sugamo were not converting to American ideology in any simple sense. But they were learning, through lived experience, that the American approach to governance, messy, trusting, participatory, could work even in contexts where Japanese military culture insisted only hierarchy and force could maintain order. In the end, the story of Sugamo prison in the months following Japan's surrender is a story about the surprising resilience of human dignity and the unexpected power of trust. The women detained there had lost everything. Their nation's victory, their emperor's divinity, their ideology's certainty, their military's pride. They were defeated, detained, facing an uncertain future in a devastated country. What they were offered, the opportunity to manage their own affairs, to exercise authority, to contribute rather than merely endure, was not charity, but recognition. Recognition that defeat does not erase capability, that surrender does not eliminate dignity, that